Welcome back to the show. In this episode of Startup in Nation, I'm joined by Ashish Gupta, a founder, investor, and advisor, and a quiet force in shaping how India's tech sector connects with the world today. Ashish has seen the startup ecosystem from every angle. He co-founded an early price comparison engine, which became one of Amazon's first India-related acquisitions. He scaled a 4,000-person outsourcing firm, and he co-founded Helion Ventures, one of India's earliest VC firms, managing $600 million across 3 funds. In this episode, we dive into how the Indian ecosystem has evolved from what Ashish calls the pots and pans stage. We explore how government regulatory approach differs in India, the shifting labor arbitrage in tech, and why Ashish believes India's biggest advantage in AI lies in its ability to blend man and machine. So, if you've ever thought about building across India and the US, or you're curious about the next wave of deep tech defense and digital infrastructure, you'll want to stick around for this. Let's get into it.
Hi, Ashish. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, absolutely. I was at the talk that you were speaking at for Stanford with Professor Dash's course, and I really enjoyed your perspectives on India ecosystem. So it's super exciting to have you on the podcast today.
Thanks.
Could you take a moment to introduce yourself and your background, who you are?
Sure. So I was born and brought up in India, have a degree in computer science from one of the IITs, and then came to Stanford in 1988 for a PhD, which was a very interesting experience because for the first time I learned how to think as opposed to take exams. And then moved to IBM Research, from there to Oracle Corporation, and then became an entrepreneur in 96. The first company that I started was acquired by Amazon, so moved to Seattle for 2 years, 98 to 2000, and then started another company in the SaaS space, but it was too early. SaaS as a model was not really legitimate at that time. So we converted it into an outsourcing company. That company is called Tavant. And my partner continues to run the company. He's grown the company to 4,000 people. Wow. And then through that experience, got enamored of where I came from, India. So moved back to India to start a venture fund in 2006. And we deployed about $600 million over the course of 8 years across 3 different funds. And then ended up coming back to the US for a variety of personal and professional reasons. And for the last 10 years, I have mainly been an independent board member and advisor to small companies.
You've been across every step of the way in the ecosystem.
And I've been fortunate.
Founder to now venture. Looking at the bigger picture of things, you mentioned that you went back to India and now are doing interactions between the 2 markets. Could you talk a little bit more about the India ecosystem, the startup ecosystem, and how it differs from that of the US?
So the Indian ecosystem is really about 20 years old. Of course, there were startups before that also, but in full force, as in VCs that have survived and entrepreneurship that has continued to grow, and the internet having arrived in a meaningful manner was mostly driven by concurrently with the cell phone, smartphone arrival. So the most recent tech boom in India, if you will, you could say is give or take the last 16 to 20 years. 2006 literally. And the Wall Street Journal started writing about Chindia, how India is the next China. So it's a young ecosystem compared to the US, compared to the Valley, but moving significantly faster because it is catching up. It is not as deep in the innovation areas, but it is moving fast on the how do you bring technology to consumers and to enterprises, because that is the catch-up game that we are playing. If I were to draw a parallel, it's like when a young college student sets up home, they spend the first several years getting the basics in place. The correct pots and pans, learning the difference between buying something inexpensive versus buying something durable, getting the furniture in place, and then the art follows maybe 10, 15 years after they've got the basics in place. And so we are in the pots and pans stage as far as the Indian ecosystem is concerned, but moving very quickly because information is universally applicable and available. The entrepreneur's hunger is even higher than the valley, if you can believe it, because there is this pent-up years and decades of desire to build stuff, which didn't get an outlet for several years, either for shortage of money or for presence of market. And because the market is also growing much faster than it is growing in the US, not in absolute values but percentages, the number of problems there are to solve, low-hanging fruit if you will, are also many more. On the flip side, the market is much smaller. India is an economy which is a fifth of the US, which then tells you that the disposable part of it is even smaller. And so the economy is smaller, and several of the enabling features of doing business are still falling in place. So what does a country do with startups vis-a-vis stock options? In the US is very well formed. I'm just using one example. In India, it is work in progress. So several of the rules, what does venture debt mean? How should the government regulate venture debt as compared to personal lending? Several of these kinds of things are falling into place. And so the ecosystem is evolving along with the market, along with entrepreneurship. I hope that gives some sense of what you were asking.
Yeah, and I love the quantum pans example that you gave as well. That's very helpful.
Yeah.
If we think about kind of the regulatory aspects and the government aspects of India, then what is the government's relationship with that startup ecosystem?
So I'll use a couple of examples to illustrate some of the differences. So for example, if you look at the financial services industry in India, the US looks like it's in the Stone Age compared to how sophisticated banking is in India. For instance, if you want to transfer money from one bank account to another, here we end up jumping through hoops. We either need Zelle or this, that, and the other. India has a standardized interface where every bank and every payment instrument needs to connect. So I can send you money literally within seconds using my bank and needing nothing else and paying nobody and requiring no other intermediary to show up. And there are many examples of this in terms of how that thinking has evolved, because the rails are much newer than they are in the US. Also, it has been built keeping in mind access to as many people as possible, as opposed to monetization. So for example, Visa and MasterCard here end up charging give or take 2% of every transaction. In India, it is a tenth of that. And actually, Visa and MasterCard were fighting the Indian government and lobbying through the US government to prevent that from coming into place. But the whole system is designed, both from a regulatory perspective and otherwise, to increase access for as many people as possible, because it's a country which is not driven entirely by profit motive. Whereas here, the capitalist ethos is so much stronger. So why am I calling this out? Coming back to the regulatory question that you were asking. So the government plays a lot of different parts. Because there are so many regulations that are being formed right now, it's a in-process economy. It's not a mature economy. So many more things are in process. It's like a startup. And therefore you can think of the whole country as one large startup within which, or a mid-stage company, within which a lot of us are building little smaller companies, if you will. And as you know, in mid-stage companies, a lot of the processes are in flux. HR is figuring out what is leave policy. Finance is figuring out how much expenses are allowed when a VP goes to travel versus a manager goes to travel. Can you order alcohol along with dinner? Okay. And then those rules change. So people who could order alcohol in the past suddenly discover that the rules have changed. Now you can no longer order. So you see some of that in India. You build companies assuming certain regulations, and then the country evolves its regulations. And the Indian regulatory evolution process is not very well thought through. You act first and then you clean up later.
Very startup mindset.
Very startup-ish, okay. And very similar to what you're experiencing here at one level, which is new for us. So that is one part of it, that the regulations are work in progress. the country has a fairly serious commitment to the startup ecosystem because they see that that is where problems will get solved much faster than if you rely on old traditional industries. So a lot of commitment. The government has created several pockets of financing to give money to other funds, to fund companies directly in certain spaces. Most recently, there was a big fracas where one of the ministers of the government made a comment that most of the entrepreneurs in India and investors are spending their time just delivering food. And why are they not solving hard technical problems like DeepMind or a whole bunch of other things? So that's created a whole bunch of brouhaha where people are getting very defensive. But he's right. Most of the problems we are solving are actually taking care of, as I had mentioned before, the pots and pans kinds of issues, which is the natural evolution. And then you start solving harder and harder problems as time goes on because the low-hanging fruit get taken. So the government is also pushing along the lines of saying, hey, do more innovation because that is long-term. So defense is one area where this is playing out in India right now. Given the geopolitical situation, every country fears for their own existence right now. And they literally cannot count on too many friends, given that people are busy declaring that I'm by myself and everybody can look out for themselves kind of stuff. And there is a lot of need for indigenous defense technologies. So there was just a terrorist attack in India 2 days ago. So defense tech is one big area, which brings you back into the regulatory environment even more so because there is only one customer, the government. So that will define new sets of regulations. But all in all, it's friendly to startups. At the same time, it is evolving because the rules are coming into play, which often hurts startups because the startups assumed something and then the rules changed. But that is part and parcel of doing business in an economy which is work in progress, so to speak.
Very fascinating points there, Ashish. And you're right. It's literally a lot of the basic infrastructure that's currently being built within India to really sustain the long-term growth of that startup ecosystem as well.
Yeah.
I heard a talk by you in 2019, and it was a seminar that you had given at Stanford.
Yes.
And one of the things that you mentioned is that during 2019, that time period, a lot of the successes of market entries into India included enterprises like Oracle, because building the basic infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
You want the off-the-counter, off-the-shelf solutions.
Yeah.
Fast forward to 2025, what does that look like for startups who might not be the big enterprises?
Yeah, very good point about, in the beginning, if you think of a buyer, let's say we are all new to the cell phone business. Chances are you will not take risks with unknown brands. You will go buy a Samsung or a Pixel or one of the well-known brands. So even the buyers grow up. Not only do the vendors grow up, the buyers also grow up in their maturity and their risk ability. If I'm a young kid and my parents have not seen a certain gadget, they will encourage me to go buy a known product. But once I've bought 3 of these, they will stop paying as much attention to it, and I can start experimenting with newer stuff. That is one of the things that is in play in India. So if we stay with just the enterprise market, because the Indian domestic market, you could think of it as the consumer market and the enterprise market. The consumers are similar, by the way, where previously they would buy known brands. Now they are willing to experiment with all kinds of brands. So if you look at the last 10 years and 2019, actually, so let's look at the last 6 years, the number of domestic consumer brands around headphones, clothing, luggage, skincare, you name your favorite category, has just exploded. There have been companies that are now valued at billions of dollars that are all out-of-the-box startups, just doing fast-moving consumer goods. Okay, and then on the enterprise side, to your point, the enterprises don't have the same risk-taking ability as consumers do, because consumers are spending $20 to buy a shirt, whereas an enterprise is committing 5 years with a product, and somebody will get fired. So enterprises adopt things slower than consumers. But there too, it is moving. And one of the reasons why it is moving even faster is because the US markets don't cater to the characteristically Indian needs. For example, let's take delivery of e-commerce products. There is not as well established last mile delivery ecosystem in India as there was in the US. So private companies filled in that space and became vendors to the dominant e-commerce players. Okay, an example of a space which is an enterprise product, namely last mile delivery services or last mile pickup services. If you want to return a product, the return infrastructure is not as strong. So there are third-party companies that say, don't worry, you need that shirt picked up from John's house, we'll pick it up for you. And then if you go to enterprises buying software, HR is slightly different in India than it is here. The policies that the government has around leave, what does pensions mean? What does statutory tax payment mean? What are the cultural nuances? Therefore, there are domestic HR software companies that now the big multinationals won't buy. However, the domestic companies will buy because they have domestic policies. And that applies to supply chain, that applies to banking, approval of loans, banks are buying software. So all of that is in a very different place in just the last 6 years. One of the companies that I had the pleasure to be involved with, a company called Perfios, they've grown from practically nothing to over $100 million in revenue in just the last 7 to 10 years, as an example of what is happening to the domestic market. So growing pretty rapidly. Lest I communicate the wrong impression, it is nowhere as large a market as the US is. So it is growing quickly, but the US continues to be a much, much larger market for even the companies that are starting in India. They will sell domestically, but they would prefer to sell in the US, given the overall size of the market, as far as the enterprise space is concerned.
Curious then, for Indian companies who are trying to break into US, what are their advantages and challenges, and then vice versa for US companies
trying to break into India. So companies from India that go to the US, there is a 40-year history of companies providing outsourced services, like one of the companies that I started 25 years ago. What does that mean? These are companies like IBM, which is of course a US company, but the kinds of things that they do. Let's say Citibank wants a large piece of software built. Citibank doesn't have the internal talent. Software outsourcing company will come and take on that job and build that software for Citibank, Target, you name it. And those are the kinds of companies I'm talking about. This is a long tradition, and these companies, there are a couple that are valued at between $70 to $100 billion. Infosys, TCS, they're big companies. 300,000 employees, for example. Okay. There is also a tradition of providing other kinds of services, call center services. You pick up the phone and say, my box is not delivered. Somebody from India would be pretending to be John with a Texas accent, and they will try and track your box down for you. Okay. That also is a long history. So that continues. And in fact, it has taken on an even more interesting form now that several of these companies are AI enabling them. Let's come back to the box tracking company. And now the call is first answered by a voice bot. And if that voice bot cannot sufficiently track your box, or you suddenly break into an Adele song and the voice bot doesn't know what to do with that, then they will hand you over to a human agent who will try and figure out whether you're calling just for entertainment or whether you asked a question that confused the bot. But the first 70-80% of your work could have gotten done by a voice bot. So that is a very interesting space for Indian companies, which is to take these traditional services and AI enable them. And that is going to be a very interesting trend for the next several years. It will destroy a lot of employment, but then people also believe that there might be other services that could move over. For example, paralegal services, where instead of paying somebody $150 an hour here in the Valley, the first draft of all of that stuff ends up getting done through a combination of a bot and a human being sitting out of India. So that is one. There are also a bunch of companies that are building enterprise software for the US market. What is the advantage in the first kind of companies? Just the number of people that you can hire, I beg your pardon, and the price that you pay them. That is in the entire services industry. You could get a person for a tenth of the monthly cost compared to the US. And then even if you mark it up 2x, you are still 5x better. And then if you add it up with more overheads, you are still 3x better. And that has been the basis of a lot of the services companies, which is just the number of people and what it costs to run these operations. In the case of software product companies, that arbitrage is not so high because Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, Cisco, Yahoo, everybody has offices in India. They also hire talent. So that talent is not 1/10 as expensive because it is higher quality talent. That talent is maybe 1/3 as expensive. So you've already lost a factor of 3 in advantage. Furthermore, sales and marketing takes up so much money that it is the same as the US. So the cost advantage is kind of suspect. And that cost advantage is coming down thanks to code development tools like Cursor or whatever else. Now, code is even cheaper to produce in the US. So that advantage is suspect going forward. And that advantage also was on the development side, not on the marketing, not on the sales, not on the senior management, because senior management ends up costing very similar in both countries for the software product companies. So your question, so what is the advantage of building a software product company out of India for the US market? It is not as clear as it was for the services companies. There are some areas where there is more advantage because there is significant domain expertise. So if you end up with somebody who has seen supply chain or procurement because they were in a services company and they built these solutions, you often get that advantage, that there is deep domain knowledge that is coming from people who have traditionally built systems for large companies, which is like getting high quality talent anywhere in the world. At a systemic level, I struggle with what that advantage is. For a software product company coming out of India, going after the US market. Okay? I think it is the disadvantages. There are a few. You are not in the market, so you are sitting 10,000 miles away. And the time zone difference is brutal. For people who are staying up both in the night and in the morning, because people come to work in the morning, but your customers stay awake at night, you can get burnt out. And if the team is divided across 2 geographies, then you have cultural problems. You can't move as quickly because often when you've seen startups, you come back from a meeting, you're very excited, you need to talk to somebody now, but the other person is asleep. So by the time they wake up, that excitement has gone away. Maybe the 2 key points have gone away. They won't fully understand what you said. So a lot of the hand-wavy things that you and I can talk about because we are standing and sitting in front of each other will be much harder to do if we were on a phone call. That energy is not there. So there are several disadvantages of doing this. In the opposite direction, people going from here to India, I've met several people who feel that they can serve the Indian market by sitting here. It's a terrible misconception. If you're a small company and you want to go to the India market, you better go there. Because the newspaper doesn't tell you what the country is like. Exactly like when Indian software companies come here, one of the founders needs to move here. Otherwise, the customers, you don't understand. So both for product and for sales, the same thing applies in the opposite direction. For companies that are targeting the Indian market, that are US startups, I also ask them another question, which is, why don't they first sell to the US, given that the US is a much larger market? And therefore, it is easier for startups to sell. Once in a while, you come up with a very unique offering, which is so Indian that it makes sense. But otherwise, mostly it is a bad idea for a US company to start pursuing the Indian market for a product that has customers in the US market. The reasons often turn out to be, oh, India is an easier market to sell, US there is too much competition. Any startup that is going to a smaller geography because they're afraid of competition is going to get killed. because they just don't know what the competition is there. It feels very fine and rosy and dandy on the other side of the fence. When they land there, they will discover that it is as hard a market to crack, except even smaller. So it is better to man up to the competition if there is a domestic market and start selling there if it's a US startup. So I would not encourage most US startups to start selling in India unless they're very clear that the offering is very, very India specific. If I'm making sense.
Okay. If I could ask then,
yes, please.
For health tech companies that are going through much stricter FDA regulations here in the US, is it an advantage for them to start in India?
Great point. The answer will be very nuanced. And by the way, I should have given you a caveat right up front. I have lots of opinions, but please treat them as just that, an opinion. Okay? And we shouldn't confuse them with...
Very insightful opinions.
Okay. So let's take health tech. Indeed, the regulations are fewer than the US, as are the price points. Much, much lower. Much lower. Also, the US healthcare market is, I think, many more than 5 times larger than the Indian healthcare market. Also, the Indian healthcare market is massively fragmented. There aren't the large hospital systems that there are in the US. So if somebody does decide that they want to pursue the Indian market, they should spend substantial time on the ground in India, not remotely, on the ground in India, figuring out how hard is it to sell, how much realization could they get in terms of dollar-denominated cost, and what is the real reason why they're going there. Are they going there to validate a product, or are they going there to really sell the product? And they're two separate things. I think it makes a lot more sense to go to India to develop the product as opposed to use that as the final market. This is what I would advise somebody if they were working with me. And why? Not because you want to abuse the Indian population by subjecting them to science experiments, but because there is lower regulation in several areas. You can ethically and morally do the right thing and yet go faster out in market. So I would use it as a geography where I indeed take healthcare products to the next level of maturity rather than as an eventual market. So more of the proto rather than the deployment place, if I'm making sense.
Yeah, no,
did I answer your question or
absolutely,
did I wander
and
off?
that's brilliant, right?
Yeah.
Is you do the validation and the initial product development in India because of the stricter regulations here.
Yeah.
But in actual market-wise, the U.S. still has a huge advantage in terms of the healthcare market.
Yeah.
You mentioned if someone were to work with you. Can you talk a little bit about the work that you're doing right now at MFV Partners, what your role is, and what area of tech are you interested in?
Yeah. So MFV Partners is a deep tech fund started by a friend and colleague of mine who's one of the most experienced deep tech investors arguably in the world. He was at Qualcomm for a decade doing tech investing for them, and he's been running MFV for a decade, has some of the most interesting robotics investments in the market. And I have the pleasure of being a venture partner with him, so I get to hang out and see cool stuff without taking on the pain and responsibility of raising money and actually doing the deployment, which he does. So I've got the best of both worlds. What technologies are of interest to me? So one area that I'm particularly interested in is using AI combined with the services model. Okay, so I personally think that not only are services industries getting disrupted with AI, but a lot of companies that build software products are going to get converted into semi-services companies. And what do I mean by that? So let's take a company that is building AI-oriented tools for the manufacturing industry. Okay, just for the sake of argument. And there are several such companies, a couple that I'm involved with also. Because the underlying tools are AI-based, they keep changing very quickly. So training your end customer to use tools that keep changing very quickly is nearly impossible. Because your end customer doesn't want quickly changing things. Imagine going to your favorite app, pick an app that you use on the phone or on the web, Instagram. And imagine that Meta kept changing the Instagram user interface every 3 days. You would probably not be a very happy user because now the post button has moved, if there is a post button, sorry, I don't know, I don't use Instagram, or the follow button, or the way the cards start looking, if they keep changing, users typically get thrown off. In the enterprise space, it is much worse because the functionality is a lot more complex. So when the underlying tool sets are changing very, very quickly, the user interfaces, how you use those tools also keep changing. So you can't wait for the entire stack to stabilize because it might not stabilize for many years. At the same time, you can solve real problems using this AI stack as it is. So you've got a host of companies that are building enterprise-facing solutions. But those solutions keep evolving very quickly, given that the stack keeps evolving very quickly. One of the reliable ways of then delivering value is to tell the customer, please don't worry about using the software. We will use it on your behalf. We will give you the end results of what would have happened because of the software. Let's take examples. If we were going to sell somebody software for analyzing their P&L or for forecasting their sales, instead of selling them software, you sell them the forecast. You sell them the analysis of the P&L, and so on and so forth. And there are innumerable examples of this that I am already in the middle of. That is one area that I am very excited about because it also plays to an unusual strength which comes back to the India advantage. I'm sorry, I should have called this out. India understands how to mix man plus machine better than the Valley does. So as several of these software companies are beginning to get a more serious white glove element to them, Indian companies have a disproportionate advantage in how do you build those organizations, how do you price those offerings, how do you finally deliver them, and even how do you sell them. So I should have called that out because that in my mind is probably a huge advantage that India out software companies have in the AI-oriented world.
Can you talk a little bit more about the man and human
in
advantage?
The middle? Sure. I'll use an example. So one of the companies that I'm on the board of builds tools to help people use their software better. So let's say you are using Salesforce. This company, which is called Whatfix, builds assistive workflows for the users of Salesforce to quickly use Salesforce because Salesforce is a complicated piece of software. So these guys build the tools to help a user of Salesforce very quickly get the job done, independent of how complex the underlying software is. So Salesforce likes it because the usage of Salesforce goes up. So Salesforce is happy. User likes it because the user doesn't have to now muck around and say, which button do I press? Oh my God, I've managed to, by mistake, create the wrong thing. What do I do now? This company sits in the middle, looks at what things do people usually do, and helps solve those problems. It's doing nearly $100 million in revenue. So clearly the solution is working. Now let's take a look at this company. They could give people the tools to figure out what are your popular use cases. And why don't you convert those use cases into these assistive flows? Instead, what do? They say, we will send you 2 people. These people will build the first 100 flows for you so that you, Mr. Customer, don't have to worry about learning how to use our tools instead of learning how to use Salesforce. Now you're stuck with another problem as opposed to the first problem. We will build the first 100 flows for you. And once you're beginning to see value, now you have motivation to say, let me build the 101st flow myself. So there is a human in the loop here who helps the customer get value for the first several use cases. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Or consider a piece of software that does quarterly revenue forecasting for your team. Okay? One is your finance team can learn it. Another thing is that this company provides a sophisticated finance professional along with the tools so that this finance professional works with your CFO, works with your CEO, works with the business leaders, but is mainly assisted by very powerful tools. So instead of you hiring a person in your finance team who learns these tools, this person knows how to drive this fancy truck, which does all the forecast. And what they ask of you is just give us your Excel sheets or point us to your QuickBooks or your NetSuite instance, and we will take care of the rest. That is a human in the loop. But you're not selling the time of this person. This is not a services company. It's not like IBM saying we charge you $60 per person. What you're still selling is a license to this forecasting software, or in my previous example, to the software which builds these assistive flows. The human in the loop is merely to bridge the gap between the complexity of the tool and the fact that the users don't want to learn these more and more sophisticated tools that are becoming possible to build because you have AI at your disposal.
Almost like a white glove service.
Exactly like a white glove service. It's the difference between selling somebody a car versus a taxi cab. Of course, we all know how to drive here, but let's say you were to go to India. You do not know how to drive in India. You do know how to drive the car, you don't know how to navigate the traffic. Okay? So think of a car in India, or a car in a country where you don't know the rules or the driving side is different. There you want to give somebody white glove service. And instead of the car company, instead of Tesla, you have Waymo, which drives you as opposed to which sells you a car. And more of these software products that are fast changing or complex lend themselves to that. And that is an entire space where I'm very bullish of, where India has an unfair advantage. But popping out to your MFV example, some of the areas that are of a lot of interest to MFV are robotics, because we know that space very well. We have some very interesting investments like Agility is a company that builds a biped robot. You would have seen the Boston Dynamics videos of a robot dancing and so on and so forth, a humanoid robot. These people's robots don't dance, but they actually get work done. So that company is doing well. So robotics is of a lot of interest to us. Also, companies that are on the edge of climate tech, because a lot of those companies, like we've got a engine that is built without rare earth metals that is doing quite well. So that is another entire space that is of a lot of interest to us. Yeah.
When we think about deep tech, I thought you explained it really well in the Stanford lecture, what deep tech is. Could you share a little bit about what deep tech is?
So you will find even more divergence of opinions on this question than on the previous opinion. So I'll give you my take on it.
Sure.
So ironically, pretty much all startups in the Valley pre the mid-90s used to be deep tech. Okay, somebody was building a new chip, somebody was building a new router, or they were building software to design chips, or so and so forth. When the consumer internet came about, starting the mid-90s, then it became feasible to build a lot of things that didn't require deep tech. They became applications. And two of us could, if I knew how to write code, maybe you do, we could get together. I would be useless in that picture because I neither know the product nor can I write the code. So you and some other more worthy partner could turn out an app very easily. Why? Because the coding tools are known, you know the problem, you build something, put it out on the Play Store, you're off to the races. So starting mid-90s, non-deep tech companies started coming about. SaaS companies also look like non-deep tech companies because it's a business application without too much technology, a lot of engineering, but without too much technology. To the point that over the 20 plus years from 1995 to let's say 2015, 2017, actually most of the investments became non-deep tech. And now we are asking ourselves, what is deep tech? Which is really ironic, okay, given the whole thing. So let me posit a definition of my own. Something that requires the product development cycle to solve problems that are more than application development. And that typically involves solving some technical problem or taking a technical problem and tweaking it so that it can actually work in a real life situation. Somebody could have built an experimental motor in a lab. Actually making that motor work in the context of a car means that the motor should be capable of running for 40 hours, whereas in the lab it caught fire after 40 minutes. You need to solve that problem. Or it emits too much heat. Or the motor constantly requires gas to be filled into it. You can't keep stopping at a gas station every 20 minutes. So there are all these kinds of problems that convert something that requires, in my mind, a year and a half or two of a product development cycle. If something doesn't require that kind of work, I put it in the app category. Now, this can apply to coming up with a drug that ends up taking 7-8 years, solving a problem that is doing better, faster execution of an AI algorithm. It will require time. So I think of deep tech companies as those where the product development cycle requires a year plus of time, as opposed to something that can start getting sold literally in the next 5-6 months. And there are lots of other definitions. There are folks who talk about stuff that is at the interface of software and hardware. And there are people who talk about stuff that require a PhD as a part of a team. So there are many different characteristics that people call out, but that's my own definition.
If I can ask a selfish question,
Please.
because I'm in the defense space myself, you touched on a little bit about India's defense space.
Yeah.
Is an area that a lot of attention is being put on right now. And that combined with the deep tech definition that you just gave, what does deep tech with India's defense industry look like?
Sure.
And what is the future of the defense industry for India?
So I personally think that future, despite the fact that it is such a destructive space, because by definition, while we call it defense tech, more often than not, it is used for aggression rather than for defense, whether one sells it to folks. So notwithstanding the struggle that I have with that entire portion, so pardon the digression, I think the future is extremely bright, because I don't see how there is a de-escalation of a trend that has been building up for so many years. These are problems where you want control of the underlying IP, because you don't want to be dependent on anybody, including people who previously seemed like friends. What is becoming clearer is people can change their minds. So starting from even the need to fabricate chips in India, to design one's own set of chips potentially, all the way to converting them into real functioning products, whether it is for delivering payloads, whether it is in drone technology, for surveillance, for actual delivering payloads through drones, all kinds of computer security, where you don't want to buy software from anybody outside because they could have backdoors that you never know. Everything is wide open. So I think just from an India domestic market perspective, it's a huge opportunity for many, many years to come.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And this is such an insightful conversation.
Thank you
Ashish.
for chatting with me.
Before we wrap this up, would love to hear if you have any advice for folks who are in the startup space and interested in exploring the market in India.
Probably the most important advice I would give to anybody who's interested in exploring India is, if you haven't already spent several months on the ground, do that. And talk to the people who are on the ground. And I think you will get much better advice than I can give you. So probably to call out the most important thing, if you haven't already spent several months in India, plan to do that if you want to go after the India market in any way, shape or form. And that will be more educational than anything I can tell you.
And awesome. Thank you,
Cool.
Ashish.
Absolutely.